Thank you, Vas, for agreeing to have this conversation with me about your work on in vitro meat and on the politics of eating animals more generally. As you know, I've asked a question about in vitro meat to several other critical animal studies scholars with whom I've had these conversations. And with the exception of Dinesh Wadawal, they've all acknowledged that there are problems with in vitro meat, which Dinesh did too, of course, but ultimately they are still in favor of these technologies because they think that in vitro meat will reduce the suffering of animals. So while the critical animal studies scholars I've interviewed are themselves vegan and not about to start eating in vitro meat themselves, the tendency seems to be to take what you describe as an animal realist position and to say that unfortunately most humans are not going to stop eating meat. So we need to find a kind of meat that causes less suffering to animals and also less environmental harm and greenhouse gas emissions. And they think in vitro meat is that solution. So you've taken a different position on in vitro meat. And I wonder if you could start out by explaining why you oppose this technology or why you disagree with most of the other critical animal study scholars with whom I've spoken.
Well, thank you very much for the question. I would say that my position about in vitro meat is critical. So it doesn't mean that necessarily there is no possibility of any worth of in vitro meat, but that as scholars, we would want to be very critical. And minimum, we'd want the product to come to market before we sort of endorsed it. And so there's a few areas that give me concern. So one area is the growth medium. So the companies and the websites will say that in vitro meat is produced slaughter-free, that they just need a few cells from the animals. However, what they don't say is that the primary growth medium that's used for these cells to be able to replicate is something called FBS. That stands for fetal bovine serum. So what is FBS? When the factory farm system is killing cows, pregnant cows, a certain percentage of them are pregnant. And so the way that they get FBS is they take the pregnant cow, they take the fetus out of the mother. The fetus is alive during this time, and they do cardiac puncture at the heart of the fetus, and then they extract the blood. That's how they get FBS, fetal bovine serum. The amount that they're able to extract per fetus is relatively small. If we think about the heart of a fetus, we can imagine it's not large. So at 3 months, they can only get out 150 milliliters. At 6 months, 350 milliliters. At 9 months, which is term, and they try to do it at term so they can get more, it's 350 milliliters. But the amount of FBS that's currently used for cell culture research is over 500,000 liters a year, every year. So that means over 2 million calves are killed in this process to create the growth medium that's used for cell culture research. So that seems grossly unvegan and grossly unethical. Now, to be fair, what the companies will say is that they are researching new alternatives, and there have been pronouncements by some of them, Mentis Meat and Just Foods, for example. Those are two companies researching in vitro meat, and they have made pronouncements for several years now that they're at the cusp of coming with something new, that they are almost there. But they won't tell us what exactly the new medium is because they claim it's an industry trade secret. And they've been making these pronouncements for several years now. And so I have some degree of skepticism, and I think we should be about pronouncements by technology companies and startups that have to woo investors and get capital, how true any of these are. But I would say even if one day they do come up with a slaughter-free growth medium, and they may, in vitro meat is still not something that I think vegans or critical animal study scholars should support. As vegans and critical animal study scholars, we don't just boycott items that have animal products in it. We also boycott animal experimentation. So for example, I won't buy a shampoo that's been tested on animals, even if the shampoo now has no animal products in it. I believe that something that's produced via the intentional causing of mass animal suffering isn't something that I ethically can or should consume or endorse. Well, what is true for shampoo or makeup is clearly vastly more true for in vitro meat. there is no question by anyone that even if one day they come up with a slaughter-free growth medium or a growth medium other than FBS, that the product has been produced via mass animal experimentation and the intentional causing of animal suffering on a mass scale. And so I don't fully understand how, as ethical vegans who boycott animal experimentation and the products of animal experimentation, how we could ever endorse in vitro meat. And I would say, even if they come up with a slaughter-free growth medium, they have still grossly violated the animal's right to consent. We could come up with great improvements in human health if we experimented on humans. We could have huge growth in cancer research, AIDS research, Alzheimer's research. So why don't we do this? Well, in fact, sometimes in human history, we have done it, and most people consider that to be grossly unethical. And I think the reason that we agree that experimentation on humans to help other humans is grossly unethical is because it violates those humans' right to consent. Well, if we wouldn't experiment on humans to help other humans, how can we justify gross violence and experimentation on animals, even if it is theoretically to help some other animals? So even if one day this research would produce something that helps animals, it's grossly unethical in and of itself to be experimenting on these female cows and their calves right now, even if we want to claim as humans that we're smarter and wiser and we know what's best for these animals, and we are going to violate their consent in order to do these experimentations. Consent matters, and no one can see a pregnant cow being sad at the death of her child and not know that they fundamentally would never consent to this procedure. So FBS and the growth medium, I would say, makes it unethical just in and of itself without any other reason. This isn't something that I think vegans can or should support. I'll make one other comment, just because you mentioned the environmental aspect. This has been widely hyped. There have been multiple news stories that have come and claimed that in vitro meat will have a large amount of environmental sustainability. So to give one example among many, Bloomberg in 2013 claimed, quote, a University of Oxford study of cultured meat estimated a 90% savings of resources, including feed, water, land, waste disposal, and greenhouse gas emissions, which all sounds really quite impressive. However, what they have left out is that this University of Oxford study was done by a single graduate student, was not a meaningful University of Oxford study in any real sense of that term, but just by a single graduate student who happened to be attending Oxford at that time and was commissioned and paid for by New Harvest, a nonprofit focused on promoting in vitro meat. And the study wasn't really a study, it was a series of thought experiments. So we just imagine in vitro meat works this way in the future based on a wide variety of technologies, which both currently do not exist, and there is no credible peer-reviewed evidence that would prove that they would ever exist in the future. All other peer-reviewed studies have actually come to the opposite conclusion, that in vitro meat is not environmentally sustainable or scalable. In fact, they've concluded that in vitro meat produces more greenhouse gas emissions, GHG, is worse for the environment, is worse for climate change than even factory farms. As one study put it, quote, cultivation of in vitro meat requires more industrial energy produced by burning fossil fuels than pork, poultry, and maybe even beef. The reason for this is while in vitro meat takes up less space than traditional farming, in order to produce this meat, they have to use a large amount of energy. They actually have like mini meat gyms they have to use to stretch the meat in order to give it muscle. And so all of this energy actually causes more greenhouse gases than even factory farms. Even if somehow in vitro meat was ethical, and I don't think it is, it would be fundamentally utopian, impossible, because it's simply not scalable. It is not environmentally sustainable, and we're literally living through the effects of climate change right now.
In your work, you've explored a series of really interesting cases of new consumer products or technologies being introduced on the capitalist market as competitors to an original product or technology. So, like the Pepsi versus Coke example, the polyester versus cotton example, the faux or plant-based meat versus animal meat comparison, and even the combustion engine or cars and trains versus horse-drawn carriages, to show that in each case, the new product or technology didn't actually reduce the consumption of the earlier product or technology, but could even increase it. And so it is also very likely the case that in vitro meat will actually result in an increase in sales of animal meat as we know it. So you acknowledge that this is counterintuitive, and so we can understand in a way why animal liberationists such as Peter Singer and critical animal studies scholars such as those I've interviewed, have kind of acknowledged some of what you've said, at least on the animal cruelty part, that this isn't pure in any sense. It's not vegan in any sense, but why they would still endorse it because they think it's still going to result in less suffering, or that it'll result in a decrease in meat consumption as we know it. But you've convincingly shown, I think, that this is not going to be the case. I wanted to have this interview in part as a rejoinder to some of what you would call the animal realist arguments. Can you explain what you would call the animal realist arguments that have been expressed in earlier interviews? So can you explain what you mean by animal realism, which is comparable to capitalist realism, and why you think it's wrong? And second, can you explain why the argument that in vitro meat will reduce the suffering of animals is also wrong based on these analogous cases that you have explored in your work?
Sure, absolutely. And before I start, let me just say, obviously, I have only the highest respect for all of the other critical animal studies scholars, even if some of them have said that they endorse in vitro meat. And I'm unsure if they really fully mean that. I suspect what they're endorsing is an idea, a thought experiment. I suspect that they may not have done the research or even know about FBS or environmental sustainability or these sorts of things, but they're imagining what if we could just clone animals without causing any kind of harm or violence. Wouldn't that be great? And I think it touches on a deeper problem that animal liberation and animal studies has tended to have, which is the danger of the thought experiment. I think perhaps coming from analytic philosophy, we've tended to engage in thought experiments, what if experiments. I think that was, for example, part of why Peter Singer originally endorsed so-called humane meat. He's engaged in a thought experiment. He imagined, what if we had a farm that could treat animals well? And so I think what we have to do is be suspicious of what ifs and thought experiments and try to find out what exactly is occurring. So what I mean by animal realism, and I'm glad you asked this question because it's actually something that was originally suggested to me by you. We were having a conversation, I don't know if you remember, but we were having a conversation about Mark Fisher's work, Capitalist Realism, Is There No Alternative? And we were talking about this saying that Mark Fisher references, that maybe Frederick Jameson said it, maybe Zizek said it. I don't think anyone knows for sure. But the saying is, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And it really made me think about how so much of what I see in the animal liberation movement is based on it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of meat eating. And we really are talking about imagining the end of the world, and the end of the world in terms of capitalism and climate change, but then also, as I think we all know, the end of the world because of meat consumption. And even as we are seeing these apocalyptic events, living through a pandemic, it's still the case that it seems to me that people are making claims that somehow we will figure out a way to keep eating meat. And I'm interested in this kind of weaponization and utilization of the term utopian or realistic. So many of these people who are making claims in favor of in vitro meat, the way they'll refer to themselves is a realist. They'll say, I'm a vegan, but I'm a realist. And then they'll argue for in vitro meat. And at the same time, they label people who are arguing for the end of meat as utopian. But what is fascinating is the data is exactly the opposite. The peer-reviewed data says we have to radically decrease global meat consumption. The UN pegs it for about 75%. And we have to do this in a very short period of time. And the data says that the current life cycle analysis, the best we have, the product hasn't come to market, of in vitro meats shows that it's not scalable or sustainable. So it's actually utopian to imagine cloning animals as a way to solve environmental problems and the problems of meat eating, and wholly realistic to try to engage in large-scale political and governmental moves to decrease the consumption of meat. So the question is, why is it that the logic always seems to flow towards greater meat consumption? Why is it that we can't, even sometimes as vegans or animal rights activists, feel comfortable articulating the need to radically decrease the consumption of meat in a short period of time, even when that is what the scientific data suggests is the most realistic, quote unquote, solution? Well, let me end by touching on your third point, which is that people say, okay, there's problems with FBS. All right, there's problems with sustainability, but at least in vitro meat will trade off with factory farms. And surely that's a positive. And factory farms are so atrocious. But I'm not even sure that's the case. In the first, they seem to sort of misunderstand how global meat consumption works. So I think they think global meat consumption is a fixed amount. So to say there's 100 pounds of meat produced a year. So therefore, every pound of meat that's produced via in vitro meat has to trade off with the pounds of meat that are produced via factory farms. But that's not how meat production actually works. Meat production is exponentially increasing. There's not a fixed amount. There's not, say, 100 pounds. So there's no trade-off. The trade-off, if it exists, is in someone in, say, India or China, switching from the primarily plant-based diet that they're currently consuming to a new meat-based diet, which is being imported and pushed on them by global markets. I mean, the plan for Tyson and Cargill and Purdue is to double meat consumption by 2050, but they're running up against very tough barriers to do so. They're running out of room or communities that will accept the pollution or regulation or increased prices. So in vitro meat is the way in which they're planning to double the meat consumption, not to trade off with the existing factory farms at all. And as you mentioned, in virtually every single other analogous consumerist item that I could find, we haven't really seen much of a trade-off, or the trade-off hasn't lasted long, or it's even led to a rise. So you could look at the plant bottle, which is something Coke came out with, which used 30% plastic in their bottled water, claiming it would trade off with plastic. And it actually led to the single largest increase in plastic usage in US history because people felt more comfortable with the product. They consumed it more, and it prevented regulatory pressures. Or you can look at lab-grown diamonds. There was a slight decrease in the market of lab-grown diamonds, but it's been marginal and it seems to have fully rebounded. Or you could look at artificial sweeteners. After years of research, all of the artificial sweeteners combined are a fraction of the sweeteners that are consumed, and people overwhelmingly still consume sugar. Or you could look at margarine and butter. Margarine originally decreased the sale of butter, but then people became worried about trans fats. They fetishized the naturalness of butter. The United States now sells far more butter than margarine. So I think the question we have to ask is, why would it be that in vitro meat would work different than virtually every single other food commodity that I can find? And why wouldn't it be more like, say, polyester and cotton? Polyester was originally expensive. If you think of ads of the 70s, people are like, get a polyester suit, it'll never wrinkle. Then it was the cost to produce it went down, and then they added it as a blended fabric, both polyester and cotton together. Is now the single largest fabric that is sold. So the result of this blending wasn't a decrease in cotton sales, it was an increase of both polyester and cotton simultaneously. How do we know that what they will do won't be just to blend traditional meat and in vitro meat. The meat industry already uses a host of fillers and is always trying to find new ones. How are we as vegan advocates and activists going to be able to argue against these new blended products, which might lead to an increased sales of both traditional meat and in vitro meat simultaneously?
Could you say a bit about the argument that's often made about horses? We didn't stop exploiting horses because of animal activism. We stopped exploiting horses when people invented the combustion engine, and then we have cars. And so now we don't exploit horses with horse-drawn carriages because we have cars. And so similarly with in vitro meat, animal activism isn't going to stop us from exploiting animals. It's this new technology that will help us. Why is that example of horse-drawn carriages versus cars actually really appropriate here, in your view?
That's a fantastic question. So advocates for in vitro meat will make the same argument a couple of different ways. Peter Singer has made this argument. Bruce Friedrich at the Good Food Institute has made this identical argument. And they say, hey, what's so great about in vitro meat is that we can have a wholly apolitical way to end speciesism and violence against animals. And to prove this point, they usually give two examples. The first example, the most common one, is the one that you gave. They say, hey, it's just like when we invented the internal combustion engine, and that solved the problem of violence against horses. And the second example they give is, and it's just like the problem of whale oil and electricity was invented, and that solved the problem of violence against whales. So this proves that we don't have to do all this difficult work of confronting speciesism or anthropocentrism or engaging in political demands. We can just use a apolitical force of technology to solve all of the effects that we're seeing. And what is striking to me is the analogies they give are actually exactly the correct analogies, but not in the way that they mean. Obviously, the effect of the internal combustion engine, cars, has been to vastly increase the suffering of horses. I mean, they're wrong on both levels. First of all, horses are still massively exploited all around the world. The United States still owns millions of horses, as do other countries around the world, almost all of whom are poorly treated. So trying to do a technological innovation and sidestepping the issue of speciesism actually doesn't help the animals at all. And additionally, cars are the major force of climate change, which is going to cause mass suffering for all of the animals, far more than they were without the invention of the cars. And the same is also exactly true for electric energy and this argument of using oil from whales. Both whales are massively still exploited and suffering all around the world and facing species extinction. And electricity, by causing climate change, is only worsening these problems. So they actually have exactly the right analogy. In vitro meat, a new technology, will in all likelihood both still allow mass suffering of animals and at the same time by being less environmentally sustainable, by using more energy, just like cars, just like electricity, actually worsen the problems of climate change, causing more suffering for all the animals.
With the car example, I also thought about roadkill, which so many animals are killed as roadkill, right? So just like car, it's just so kind of ironic to use cars as an example of how we stop killing animals.
Absolutely. And not just roadkill, but migration patterns, where the migration patterns of all the animals are permanently disrupted by the huge highway that goes through them. I mean, why is there so much roadkill? Why are animals willing to risk their lives to cross these 4-lane interstates? It's because they have no other option in many cases. It's just because of where their food is, where their mating grounds is, where they need to move. So it's hard to imagine a technology that has been worse for animals than cars, the industrial highway system, etc. And yet that is the analogy that is being used to justify in vitro meat. So let's concede the analogy. That is the correct analogy, and then realize that we need to stop making the same mistakes.
I think I know how you're going to answer this, but I wanted to ask anyway. Do you think that there is any case to be made for in vitro meat being used exclusively for pet food in the case of obligate carnivores, such as cats? Might that be a lesser evil? This is something we've talked about before, the difficulty of pet food for vegans who have pets who are obligate carnivores. So, and that had kind of been the hope that I had in vitro meat, that maybe there would be a way to make in vitro meat cat food using human cells. I guess that's a different question. So not just in vitro meat using slaughter-free methods that are still not vegan, but what about using the technology to make pet food with human cells? Would that be something that you would be open to?
I mean, the short answer is I haven't done the research on that particular area of in vitro meat, and so I don't know. And that is the opinion that I really would want other scholars to take with in vitro meat. You know, my advisor, Ursula Heise, who's speaking at this first conference for NACAS, what she used to always tell me is the most important thing you can say as a scholar is, I don't know. And so it is not my case or my claim that I fully know all the effects of in vitro meat, because I don't. The product hasn't even come to market yet. All I'm trying to do is say, hey, scholars and activists, let's pause. If we make a host of public pronouncements, that's what's happening right now, that are strongly in favor of in vitro meat. If later we find out that some of these concerns are very troubling, that is going to be very difficult to redo. So how is it that scholars who are so astute at the commodity fetish and the way that capitalism fails and the way that industry tricks us, that critique the way that Apple has redesigned its products to sound like spaceships launching when you open the box, why are we not more using these tools of analysis on in vitro meat and saying, hey, there could be some benefits, there could be some interesting areas to explore, but there also are very severe concerns that people don't even know about because the industry is doing a very good job of not telling people.
As a final question, I wondered if you could tell us a bit about your current book project, which I know at one point was tentatively titled Happy Meals and is now tentatively titled Cash Cow, which will include this argument on in vitro meat, I expect, as well as other examples concerning capitalism and animal oppression.
The book that I'm trying to work through now is, as you say, tentatively titled Cash Cow, Animal Liberation Against Capitalism and Climate Change. And here is the essential argument that I'm trying to make. So the term I use is structural speciesism. When one rereads Animal Liberation, what comes across is the lack of any political project. Peter Singer is actually quite explicit in the text and in follow-up interviews and publications that he, as a capitalist realist, well, maybe he doesn't think capitalism is ideal, it isn't something he thinks any animal advocate should waste any time on trying to address. The phrase he uses is, we have enough on our plate with animal rights that we shouldn't have to think about capitalism. That was already true in animal liberation, and it's become even more prevalent on his research on poverty reduction now via effective altruism, where he's even more explicit that this should be done by individual acts of charity, not a collective act of, say, ending global debt via Jubilee Project or confronting neoliberal exploitation of corporations or even raising a minimum wage. It should just be individual acts. Well, that's the sort of formulation of animal ethics that comes across in animal liberation, that we should vote with our dollars, that we individually should do these individual actions, and somehow individually, we collectively will produce a change, a power change, kind of a multi-level marketing version of veganism. We go vegan, we convince two people to go vegan, they convince two people to go vegan. Eventually, the whole world goes vegan. And so we can see some results of the way that this is articulated. We can see, for example, John Mackey, the former CEO of Whole Foods, who is a vegan, vegetarian, but an avid libertarian and an avid capitalist, and actually wrote a book called Conscious Capitalism. So we can see this kind of joining of animal liberation and capitalism together. You can see it in promotions of humane meat. You can see it now in promotions of in vitro meat. The two are thought of together and they're thought of individually. And so in contrast to this, I want to argue for the need for a kind of structural change, a collective change that is something more than individual. You know, the slogan, the personal is political, it's fascinating to me that over time, I keep seeing it inverted. The actual original coining of the phrase was you can't solve any personal problems without political change. There are no personal solutions. And yet now I hear it used in exactly the opposite way. Well, I'm personally doing this, so I'm doing a political change. And I don't believe there are any personal solutions to speciesism. And I think we have to engage in a collective change, a political demand to make actual changes. When you read Jonathan Safran Foer, he has this weird aside where he's like, here's why factory farm was invented. This one farmer accidentally got way more chickens than she intended. And so then there were factory farms. And this is, of course, an absurd idea. And so I think we have to ask ourselves, if necessity was the mother of invention, why are there factory farms? And I think there's kind of a sort of speciesism where people go, well, there must be factory farms because humans want meat. That doesn't really make sense. Humans eat meat now at a rate that is larger than it's been in world history. And there's all these parenting guides of children not wanting to eat meat and ways to trick them into eating meat. There's a study that just came out from Harvard that talked about how large numbers of children go vegetarian or vegan, even when their parents aren't. And so it's really not human nature that we have factory farms. And so what you actually find is this political project where labor was bought off by ever cheaper meat, where union organizers were saying, look, we don't have enough money to be able to buy meat, in contrast to immigrant groups who they thought were decreasing their wages. And the government responded to this by mass subsidies of meat. And they've kept it up. Meat actually is negatively correlated to inflation since the 1940s. Every year, meat gets cheaper. And we actually just recently witnessed this with two different presidents. Both Trump and Biden have responded to increase in price of meat by decreasing it. You know, we have the phrase bread and circuses, but I think the correct phrase should be meat and gas, because it seems to be a political project to buy off anger at inflation, decreased wages, political instability by politically ever decreasing the price of meat and gas. Cheap gas and cheap meat, a chicken in every pot, help people to feel wealthy, even as their real wages have plummeted. So if there is a connection, a nexus of capitalism and meat, and if there is a political project that's helping to support that, we can only ever make real change if we start to articulate real political demands. I'll just end on this one thing that I don't know if everyone knows. In the United States context, dairy is already a zombie industry. It loses money, more money than it makes every year. If the individual boycott, if the vote with your dollar idea was ever going to be effective, it would already have worked in terms of dairy. People are lactose tolerant. They just don't like milk. They prefer almond milk. That idea of individual consumerism has already succeeded. So why don't we see the collapse of the dairy industry in the United States? The answer is the United States government replaces it dollar for dollar. And what I find so stunning is if you look through the book, Clean Meat by Paul Shapiro, he actually makes this argument. He talks about Truman and meat prices. And he says we have to do in vitro meat because there is such complete political support of meat in the United States that we have to find a way to create meat for people to eat. And I would say exactly the opposite, that we have to articulate animal liberation as a collective and political project if we want to be able to make real change.